The air in the Imperial Arena crackled with a unique blend of terror and ambition. From my hiding spot behind a stack of hay bales, smelling of dust and honest labor, I watched the culmination of my family's dreams turn into their most public nightmare. Kaiser, the Emperor's new warhorse, was a living storm of black muscle and furious spirit. His hooves, the size of dinner plates, tore great divots from the manicured sand. His screams of rage echoed off the marble stands where the entirety of the Empire's elite sat frozen in shock. My stepsister, Serafina, was a crumpled heap of white silk and broken pride near the arena wall. Having been thrown so violently, I was surprised she hadn't broken her neck. My father, Duke Valerius, was ashen-faced, his political aspirations evaporating with every snort of the untamable beast. Beside him, my stepmother, Isolde, gripped the railing, her perfectly painted face a mask of disbelief and fury. This was their moment, the one they had schemed for, lied for, and killed for. And it was spectacular, sublime chaos. They had spent a fortune promoting Serafina as the chosen rider, the one maiden in the Empire with the grace and skill to tame the legendary horse gifted by the Xerxesian king. A successful ride would have all but guaranteed her betrothal to the crown prince, cementing our family's rise to the pinnacle of power. But Kaiser wasn't a stepping stone. He was a king in his own right, and he did not suffer fools. He bucked and reared, scattering the imperial guards who cautiously tried to approach him. The emperor himself, a man known for his iron composure, looked dangerously close to losing his temper. His gaze swept the arena, a silent demand for a solution. My family was panicking. I could see it in the frantic, whispered conversation between my father and stepmother. They were searching for a scapegoat, a reason for this failure that didn't point to their own arrogance and Serafina's utter incompetence. Their eyes scanned the royal stable staff, the very people they had disdained for months, as if one of us lowly commoners held the key. And, in a way, one of us did. A low, rumbling whinny reached me, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. It wasn't a cry of aggression, but of distress. Kaiser was magnificent, but he was also terrified, surrounded by enemies in a strange land. Taking a deep breath, I pushed myself away from the hay bales. I was just a boy to them, Aryan, the quiet, stable hand with an uncanny way with difficult animals. My face was smudged with dirt, my hair roughly chopped, and my body hidden under a loose-fitting tunic. No one had ever given me a second glance. That was about to change. I slipped under the arena railing and began to walk calmly toward the maelstrom. A gasp went through the crowd. A guard shouted for the stupid boy to get back. My father's eyes widened, first in annoyance at the interruption, then in a flicker of dawning, horrified recognition. He hadn't seen his own daughter in a year, not since I had run away, but perhaps some paternal instinct, long buried under layers of ambition and neglect, was stirring. Aryan, no! It was Jorlan, the royal stablemaster, his voice rough with genuine concern. He was the only person who had shown me any kindness in this new life. I ignored them all. My focus was solely on the terrified animal at the center of the ring. I didn't approach him head-on. Instead, I began to hum, a soft, tuneless melody I had used in the dead of night to soothe him when the nightmares came. Kaiser's frantic movements slowed. One of his ears swiveled in my direction, then the other. His wild eyes, full of fire and fear, found mine. The screaming stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural sigh that shuddered through his massive frame. I kept walking, my steps slow and steady. When I was a few feet away, I stopped and held out a hand, palm up. "It's all right, my king," I murmured, my voice too low for anyone else to hear. "I'm here. You are safe." The stallion, who had nearly trampled 3 of the Emperor's finest knights, took a hesitant step toward me, then another. He lowered his great head and gently, so gently, nudged his muzzle into my waiting hand. The silence in the arena was absolute. Every noble, every courtier, every servant watched in stunned disbelief as the ferocious warhorse of legend nuzzled a simple stable boy like a lost foal. My family stared, their panic morphing into a new, far more potent kind of terror. This wasn't just a failure to secure a betrothal anymore. This was an impossibility, a miracle that threatened to expose every secret they had ever kept. The emperor rose from his throne, his eyes fixed on me. "Stable boy!" he boomed, his voice resonating with regal authority. "Who are you?" I gave Kaiser one last reassuring pat before turning to face the royal dais. I looked past the emperor, past the intrigued crown prince, and locked eyes with my father. I gave him a small, cold smile. Then, I reached up and pulled off the worn leather cap that concealed my hair. The crudely cut locks, now grown out, tumbled down past my shoulders in a cascade of familiar silver blonde, the signature color of the women of House Valerius. "My name," I announced, my voice clear and steady, "is Alara, and I am Duke Valerius's firstborn daughter." The collective gasp of the entire imperial court was the first note in the symphony of my revenge. In my first life, I died on a crisp autumn morning, the smell of damp earth and crushed leaves filling my lungs. It wasn't a peaceful death. It was the wrenching snap of bone, the blinding pain, and the final, horrifying realization that I had been betrayed. My horse, Stardust, a gentle giant I had raised from a foal, had panicked at the final jump in the regional equestrian championship. His leg had shattered, and we had gone down in a tangle of limbs and broken dreams. His screams of agony were the last thing I heard. My death was ruled a tragic accident. Everyone said so. My father, Duke Valerius, gave a somber eulogy about the unpredictable nature of the sport. My stepmother, Isolde, shed perfectly timed tears for her beloved stepdaughter. And my stepsister, Serafina, who had graciously stepped aside to let me compete that day, looked the very picture of heartbroken grief. They were all liars. I knew, even as the darkness took me, that Serafina had done something. I had seen her near Stardust's stall the night before, a sweet smile on her face, and a bucket of his favorite oats in her hand. I had thought nothing of it. We were sisters, after all, or so I had believed. My family's cruelty wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping frost that had set in the day my father remarried, 5 years after my mother passed away. Isolde arrived with her daughter Serafina, and from that moment, the warmth in our home vanished. I was a living, breathing reminder of my father's first wife, a woman the entire duchy had adored. Isolde couldn't compete with a ghost, so she decided to erase the ghost's legacy, me. It began with small things. My riding lessons were cut short. My tutors were dismissed. The servants were instructed to tend to Serafina's needs first. My father, caught in the web of his new wife's cloying affection, saw none of it, or rather, he chose not to see it. He was a man who craved a peaceful life and a powerful station, and Isolde promised him both as long as her daughter's path was clear. I was an obstacle. My only solace was the stables. With horses, there was no deception. There was only honesty, trust, and a silent understanding. I had a gift, an innate ability to connect with even the most difficult animals. While Serafina was practicing her curtsies and memorizing political lineages, I was mucking out stalls and learning the language of the herd. This gift, which should have been my family's pride, became their greatest source of resentment. It was a talent Serafina, for all her expensive training and perfectly tailored riding habits, simply did not possess. She could ride, yes, but she commanded with fear and force. I led with trust and respect. The horses knew the difference. The equestrian championship was supposed to be my triumph. The prize was a recommendation to the Royal Knight Academy, a path to independence and a life away from my suffocating family. That was why they couldn't let me win. In my last moments, I remembered the faint, bitter scent on Stardust's breath as I'd tacked him up that morning. It was aconite, wolfsbane. Not enough to kill, but enough to induce panic and arrhythmia under stress, a poison favored by assassins and apparently by jealous stepsisters. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the afterlife. I was in my own bed, the morning sun streaming through my window. My body was whole, uninjured. My calendar read a date exactly 1 year before my death. I was 16 again. The air in my lungs felt sharp, real. It wasn't a dream, it was a second chance. And with it came a chilling clarity. The grief, the shock, the betrayal from my past life had coalesced into a single, diamond-hard purpose: vengeance. I didn't scream or cry. I lay in bed for hours, my mind racing, piecing together the memories of the future I had already lived. I remembered every slight, every whispered insult, every calculated act of sabotage. I remembered my father's averted eyes, Isolde's false sympathy, and Seraphina's triumphant smirk hidden behind a lace handkerchief at my funeral. Most importantly, I remembered the events of the coming year. I remembered my family's growing obsession with marrying Seraphina to the crown prince. I remembered the gossip about the untamable Warhorse arriving from Xerxia, a diplomatic gift to the emperor. And I remembered the grand trial, Seraphina's humiliating failure, and how my family had managed to spin the disaster, blaming a stable hand for improperly saddling the horse. They had survived the scandal, their reputation only slightly tarnished. Not this time. In this life, I would not be a victim. I would be the architect of their downfall. They had underestimated me, seen me as a quiet, pliable girl who could be pushed aside. They had no idea that their greatest threat wasn't a rival noble house or a political misstep. It was the forgotten daughter they had left for dead. My plan began with my own disappearance. I spent the first week of my new life acting exactly as I always had, the dutiful and quiet daughter. I ate my meals in silence, endured Isolde's passive-aggressive comments, and ignored Seraphina's smug condescension. But inside, I was a whirlwind of activity. I stitched a small bag and slowly filled it with dried fruit, a block of cheese, and a few coins I had saved. I sold a small locket my mother had given me, the one thing they hadn't taken, to a traveling merchant for a pittance. But it was enough. The hardest part was leaving my horses, especially my beloved Stardust. The night before I left, I crept into the stables. He nickered softly, nudging my cheek with his velvet nose. "I'll be back for you," I whispered, burying my face in his mane. "I promise. When this is all over, you'll have fields of green to run in, far away from here." Leaving him was a pang in my chest, a necessary sacrifice. I left a note on my pillow. "I can no longer endure this life. Do not search for me." It was vague enough to suggest a desperate act, perhaps a leap into the river that ran along our lands. It would give them cover, allow them to play the part of the grieving family while secretly celebrating my absence. Then, under the cover of darkness, I walked away from the Valerius estate forever. My first stop was a small town several leagues away. There, I used my meager funds to buy a boy's set of clothes and a sharp knife. In the reflection of a grimy tavern window, I sawed off my long, silver-blonde hair. It fell to the ground in a shimmering pool, and with it, Alara of House Valerius vanished. In her place stood Arion, a wiry, determined boy with eyes that held the wisdom of 2 lifetimes. My destination was the capital city. It took me 2 weeks to get there on foot, working for food and shelter at farms along the way. My knowledge of animal husbandry, something my family had scorned as unladylike, was now my key to survival. I arrived at the capital gates smelling of the road and livestock, but with a fire in my belly. The royal stables were a city unto themselves, a sprawling complex of stone and timber that housed the finest horseflesh in the empire. Getting a job there was my first major hurdle. I found the stable master, a formidable man with a scarred face and calloused hands named Yorlan, barking orders at a dozen young grooms. "Looking for work, boy?" he grunted, barely glancing at me. "Yes, sir," I said, pitching my voice lower. "I'm good with horses." He snorted. "Every runaway farm boy says that. What makes you special?" "Let me show you." I pointed to a fiery chestnut stallion that was fighting against its reins, 2 experienced grooms struggling to hold it. "That one. His back left shoe is loose. It's pinching his frog. He's not angry, he's in pain." Jorlan's eyes narrowed. He strode over to the horse, ran a hand down its leg, and lifted the hoof. His eyebrows shot up. He pulled a farrier's tool from his belt, pried off the shoe, and the horse immediately calmed, letting out a grateful sigh. The stablemaster turned and stared at me, a long, appraising look. "What did you say your name was?" "Arion, sir." "You've got the eye, Arion," he said, a grudging respect in his voice. "The work is hard and the pay is miserable. You start at sunrise mucking out stalls. You're on probation. One mistake, and you're out." "Thank you, sir," I said, my heart soaring. "You won't regret it." And he didn't. For the next 11 months, I became the hardest working groom in the royal stables. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. I took the most difficult, ill-tempered horses that no one else wanted, and with patience and understanding, I won them over. I learned the routines, the gossip, the politics of the royal court as seen from the servant's perspective. I heard whispers of Duke Valerius's frantic search for his lost daughter, a performance designed to elicit sympathy from the court. I also heard of his relentless campaign to promote Serafina, his prodigal daughter, as the future of equestrianism. It was all falling into place. And then, one day, the trumpets sounded. A grand procession arrived from the east bearing gifts from the Xerxesian king. At the center of it, housed in a gilded carriage, was Kaiser. He was even more magnificent than the legends claimed. He was a creature of myth, pure black from nose to tail, with an intelligence in his eyes that was almost human, and he was utterly, completely wild. He nearly killed his handlers getting him into his designated stall, a specially reinforced enclosure at the far end of the stables. The emperor was enthralled and frustrated in equal measure. He wanted the horse tamed to be his personal mount in the upcoming victory parade, but Kaiser would let no one near him. Knights tried, famous beastmasters tried. They all left bruised, battered, or terrified. This was my moment. While the rest of the stable slept, I began my secret visits. I used my knowledge from my first life, knowledge no one else could possibly have. I knew Kaiser had been raised in the Xerxesian highlands, where a specific type of tart red apple grew wild. They were his comfort, his taste of home. I had spent months searching the markets and cultivating a small tree I'd found growing in a forgotten corner of the castle gardens. The first time I offered one to him through the bars of his stall, he froze. He sniffed it, his eyes widening in recognition. He devoured it in 2 bites, then looked at me, a silent question in his gaze. Night after night, I returned. I never pushed, never demanded. I just sat outside his stall, humming the wordless songs of the Xerxesian horse tribes I'd read about in a rare book. I spoke to him of mountains and open plains. I told him he was safe. Slowly, cautiously, he began to trust me. I was the first person he allowed to touch him. I discovered a poorly healed scar on his flank, hidden beneath his dark coat, that was sensitive to the touch. I treated it with a soothing balm Jorlin used, and Kaiser's gratitude was palpable. Jorlin knew, of course. Not everything, but he saw. He would find me some mornings, asleep in the hay outside Kaiser's stall, with the giant horse resting peacefully just inches away. He never asked questions. He just started leaving an extra food ration for me and began assigning me tasks that kept me near Kaiser's end of the stables. He saw the bond, and like any true horseman, he respected it. As the date of the grand trial approached, my family's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Serafina was everywhere, her portrait commissioned by a famous artist, poems written in her honor. She was the Empress of the Stirrup, the Horse Whisperer. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They were building a pedestal so high that when she fell, the entire world would see it. And I would be the one to kick it out from under her. The night before the trial, I gave Kaiser a final red apple. "Tomorrow," I whispered, stroking his powerful neck. "Tomorrow, we show them all who you truly are, and who I truly am." He nudged me in response, his dark eyes seeming to understand everything. The day of the grand trial dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a public execution of ambition. The imperial arena was a sea of color and sound. Banners snapped in the wind, representing every noble house in the empire. The murmur of 10,000 voices created a low hum of anticipation. I stood in the shadows of the entrance tunnel, dressed in my simple stable boy's garb, my heart a steady drum against my ribs. This wasn't nervousness. It was the calm of a predator about to spring its trap. Serafina made her grand entrance. She was dressed in an absurdly impractical riding habit of white silk and gold thread, designed more for a ballroom than a saddle. 2 grooms led her mount, a docile white mare that served only to get her to the center of the arena where Kaiser waited, held by 4 of the strongest men from the Imperial Guard. He was fighting them, his muscles bunched like coiled springs. My stepsister dismounted with what she thought was elegant grace, though to my practiced eye it was stiff and uncertain. She approached Kaiser with a riding crop in one hand and a condescending smile on her face, as if she were dealing with a slightly naughty pony. Easy now, you big brute, she cooed, her voice carrying across the silent arena. Serafina is here to teach you some manners. I had to suppress a laugh. She was using the exact same tone Isolde used on me when I was a child. It was a voice that dripped with false sweetness and barely concealed contempt. Kaiser reacted instantly. He reared back with a furious scream, the guards barely managing to hold onto the lead ropes. Serafina stumbled backward, her composure cracking. My father and Isolde watched from the Duke's box, their faces tight with anxiety. They knew this was it. All their political capital, all their schemes, rested on this one moment. The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Crown Prince Alaric watched with a frown, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a true horseman. I knew from my first life that he found Serafina's posturing as distasteful as I did. Bring me the bridle, Serafina commanded, her voice sharp with frustration. A groom scurried forward with a vicious-looking curb bit, a tool of pain and control. This was her final mistake. I knew from my nightly sessions that Kaiser had a sensitive mouth. He responded to pressure and trust, not pain. The moment the cold metal touched his lips, he exploded. It was a detonation of pure equine fury. He snapped a lead rope with a single toss of his head, sending one guard flying. The others scattered for their lives. Serafina shrieked and tried to run, but she tripped on the hem of her ridiculous outfit. Kaiser, now completely free, galloped around the arena, a whirlwind of righteous anger. He didn't attack her. He wasn't a killer. But he made a pass so close that the wind from his passage knocked her flat into the dirt, smearing her pristine white silk with mud and humiliation. The crowd erupted in a mixture of panic and jeers. The spectacle was a disaster. My family was ruined. Isolde looked like she was about to faint. My father had aged 10 years in as many seconds. It was everything I had hoped for, and now for the final act. As the guards tried and failed to corner the enraged stallion, I stepped out from the shadows and began my long walk. The whispers started immediately. Who is that boy? Is he insane? He'll be killed. I ignored them. I began to hum my quiet tune. Kaiser's rampage slowed. His head came up, his ears twitching. He saw me, and a visible change came over him. The wild fury in his eyes softened into recognition. He stopped, his sides heaving, and waited. I walked right up to him, placing a hand on his sweaty neck. Shh, my king, I murmured. The foolishness is over now. I stroked his muzzle, wiping away a fleck of foam. He leaned into my touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating through his chest. The arena was so quiet you could hear the silk banners rustling. I vaulted onto his back as easily as I had done 100 times in the dead of night. No saddle, no bridle, just me and him. I leaned forward, my hands resting lightly on his withers. With a gentle nudge of my knees, I asked him to walk. He obeyed without hesitation. We began a slow, calm circuit of the arena. We moved past a stunned Serafina, who was now being helped to her feet, her face a mess of tears and dirt. We moved past the open-mouthed guards. We moved with a grace and unity that spoke of a bond forged not of dominance, but of absolute trust. We came to a stop directly in front of the royal box. The Emperor rose, his face a thunderous mask. "Stable boy," he demanded, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Who are you? How did you do this?" This was the moment. I looked up, letting my gaze sweep over the thousands of watching faces. I found my father's eyes and held them. I saw the dawning horror, the final soul-crushing realization of who I was and what I had done. With a deliberate slowness, I pulled the worn cap from my head. My silver blonde hair, the unmistakable heritage of my mother's line, tumbled free. The sun caught it, creating a halo of light. "My name," I declared, my voice ringing with a strength I never knew I possessed, "is Alara, firstborn daughter of Duke Valerius. A daughter he and his wife cast out to perish so that her sister could take her place. A daughter they told the world had run away in shame." A wave of shock rolled through the stands. I turned my attention back to the Emperor. "Your Majesty, This horse was not tamed with whips or cruel bits. He was won with kindness. He needed a friend, not a master. My family, in their blind ambition, could never understand that. They see only tools and stepping stones, whether it is a noble creature like this, I patted Kaiser's neck, or their own flesh and blood. The Emperor's gaze shifted from me to my father, and the temperature in the arena seemed to drop by 20 degrees. The Duke began to stammer, sputtering denials, but his face, pale and sweaty, was a portrait of guilt. Isolde was silent, her malevolent energy utterly defeated. The Crown Prince was staring at me, not with pity, but with a look of profound, undisguised admiration. "Guards!" the Emperor commanded, his voice like the crack of a glacier. "Arrest Duke Valerius and his wife. Seize their assets pending a full investigation into the matter of his daughter, Lady Alara." As armored hands clamped down on my father's shoulders, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no remorse in them, only hatred for the girl who had refused to stay broken. I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of justice. I gently urged Kaiser into a canter and then a gallop. We flew around the arena, a vision of freedom and power, my hair streaming behind me like a banner of victory. The crowd, silent moments before, erupted into a deafening roar of applause. It wasn't for a duke's daughter, it was for the stable girl who had tamed the untamable. The aftermath was swifter and more absolute than I could have ever imagined. Justice, when wielded by an emperor, is not a scalpel, it is a guillotine. The investigation was a mere formality. Under the intense scrutiny of the emperor's inquisitors, the web of lies my family had woven for years unraveled in a matter of days. Servants from our estate, long silenced by fear, came forward with stories of Isolde's cruelty and the Duke's willful neglect. Financial records revealed the exorbitant sums spent promoting Serafina, while my own education and welfare funds were mysteriously diverted. The final nail in their coffin was the testimony of a disgraced apothecary from our village. He confessed to selling Serafina a vial of wolfsbane on the eve of the equestrian championship a year ago, believing it was for exterminating pests in the stables. Duke Valerius was stripped of his title, his lands, and his honor. His name was struck from the peerage. He was sentenced to live out his days in a remote northern monastery, a place of cold stone and silent contemplation, a fitting prison for a man who had valued ambition over blood. My stepmother Isolde, the architect of so much of my pain, was exiled. With no title, no wealth, and a reputation so toxic that no noble house would dare associate with her, she was forced to return to the impoverished barony from which she came, a fate she considered worse than death. And Serafina? Her punishment was perhaps the most poetic. Without her beauty, which had been marred by a lasting scar on her cheek from her fall, and without her family's name, she had nothing. She was last seen accepting a position as a lady's companion to a cruel, aging countess in a backwater province, a life of servitude mirroring the one she and her mother had tried to force upon me. My own rise was as meteoric as their fall. The emperor, deeply impressed and profoundly shamed that such injustice had occurred under his reign, publicly restored my title as Lady Alara. But he did more than that. He declared me a ward of the crown, granting me the entirety of the former Valerius estates as my personal fiefdom, to be managed as I saw fit. Stardust, along with all the other horses I had loved, were brought to the capital to live in a style befitting heroes. I was no longer just a lady. I was the Kaiserin, the Empress of Horses, a living legend. The Emperor, recognizing my true talent, appointed me to the newly created position of Imperial Master of Horse, giving me command over all the royal stables, cavalry, and breeding programs. The role came with a seat on the small council and a level of influence my father could have only dreamed of. Jorlan, my gruff but loyal mentor, became my trusted right hand, his face beaming with a pride that felt more paternal than anything my own father had ever shown me. Crown Prince Alaric, who had witnessed my triumph in the arena, began a very formal, very public courtship. It was not a political arrangement brokered by families, but a courtship built on mutual respect. He was drawn not to my title or my land, but to the strength he had seen in the stable boy named Arian. He loved me for the grit under my nails, not the silks on my back. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would ride Kaiser out across the rolling hills of my new lands. with no saddle, no bridle, and the wind in my hair. I was no longer a victim, no longer a ghost of a forgotten daughter. I was Alara, a woman reborn from the ashes of betrayal, who had taken her pain and forged it into a crown. Kaiser would stretch into a gallop, his powerful strides eating up the ground, and I would laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom echoing across the fields of my hard-won kingdom. Justice had been served, and it tasted sweeter than any apple.